Hello guys! Have you ever stopped to think about what a night was really like thousands of years ago? No streetlights, no phone, no candle, nothing. Complete darkness. And in that profound darkness, our ancestors didn't just survive, they evolved in absolutely fascinating ways. Today we're going to explore how the ancient night shaped our senses, our societies, and even the fears we still carry. It's a journey through darkness that might make you see light in a completely different way. So get comfortable, turn off the lights if you want, and let's go. The last ray of sun. Imagine for a moment that you're about 50,000 years in the past. The sun is setting on the horizon, painting the sky orange, pink, and then deep purple. You feel the warmth of the day beginning to dissipate, giving way to a cooler breeze that touches your skin. Around you, other members of your group begin to move with a calm but determined urgency. It's not panic, it's ritual, it's survival. Because when the last ray of sun disappears, something profound happens. It's not just darkness, it's a complete transformation of the world around you. The African savanna, which minutes ago was visible to the horizon, now becomes a mystery. The trees you saw clearly become black silhouettes against a sky that still holds a last breath of light. And then, gradually, even that disappears. This transition from day to night was, for our ancestors, one of the most significant moments of each 24-hour cycle. It was the time to return to shelter, to light the fire if there was one, to gather the group. It was when the known world retreated to the circle of light around the fire, or to the absolute darkness of a cave. But what happened after? What was it really like to experience a night without artificial light? Let's start with the sky. Look up now, if it's nighttime. How many stars can you see? Maybe a few if you're lucky and away from the city. Maybe none if you're in an urban center. Now imagine a sky where you can see not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of stars with the naked eye. The Milky Way isn't a shy band, it's a river of light crossing the sky, so bright it casts soft shadows on the ground. Our ancestors lived under that sky every night. And it wasn't just beautiful. It was functional. It was their map, their calendar, their clock. The position of the stars told them when to plant, when to harvest, when to migrate. The moon, in its phases, regulated hunting and fishing cycles. The night sky wasn't decoration. It was vital information. But let's talk about what's down here on the ground in the darkness. Close your eyes for a moment. Now imagine that when you open them, there's no difference. The darkness is the same. You don't see your hand inches from your face. You don't see the ground beneath your feet. You don't see the others around you, even though they're so close you can hear their breathing. This was the reality on a moonless night, without fire, in a closed cave or shelter. And in that darkness, something extraordinary happened. Your other senses didn't just compensate for the lack of vision. They sharpened in ways we can barely comprehend today. Sound became three-dimensional. You could hear not just the noise, but the distance, the direction, even the texture of what made the sound. The crack of a branch 20 meters away wasn't just a noise, it was information, weight of what stepped on it, speed, direction of movement. A whisper of wind in the leaves told you where the wind came from and what it might bring. Rain, temperature change, maybe the smell of smoke from another distant group. The sense of smell too. Think about how much we ignore smells today. But for those living in darkness, smell was vision. The smell of nearby water, the smell of animals, and being able to distinguish between a peaceful herbivore and a dangerous predator. The smell of edible plants, the smell of other humans, which could indicate whether they were from the group or strangers, and touch. The texture of the ground under bare feet told you where you were. Sand, packed earth, stone, vegetation. The air temperature told you the approximate time of night. The coldest was usually just before dawn. The humidity in the air told you if rain was coming. Do we really use all our senses today? Or have we become overly dependent on vision? The ancient night wasn't just an absence of light. It was a completely different sensory world, and our ancestors became masters in that world. But there's something deeper happening here. Something that shaped not just our senses, but our very social and psychological structure. When night fell, safe space contracted dramatically. During the day, you could wander, explore, hunt in an area of kilometers. At night, your safe world might be just a few meters around the fire, or the interior of a shelter. This contraction forced proximity. It forced cooperation. It forced communication. It's in this context that many anthropologists believe complex language truly flourished. Yes, we needed language to hunt during the day, but at night, sitting around a fire is when we began to tell stories. Not just, there's a lion there and that's information, but let me tell you about the lion I saw 3 moons ago. That's narrative, that's culture. The night created time for reflection. During the day, you were busy surviving, hunting, gathering, building, moving. But at night, especially the long winter nights, you had hours where physical activity was limited. You had to stay quiet, stay close to the group, stay in the safe place. And in that time, the mind wandered. It planned, it remembered, it imagined. Think about it. Was the darkness of night the cradle of human imagination? There's something deeply poetic about that. The absence of external visual stimulus forced the brain to create its own images. The stories told around the fire became vivid in the mind because there was no visual competition. You weren't looking at a screen, you were looking at the darkness or at the dancing fire, and your mind painted the images of the story. And these stories weren't empty entertainment. They were education. They were survival maps. Let me tell you about the valley with treacherous waters. Let me tell you about the plant that looks safe but makes you sick. Let me tell you about the signs the sky shows before a storm. All of this wrapped in narrative, in characters, in drama, because that's how the human brain best stores information. Darkness also shaped our deepest fears. And here it's worth understanding something important. Fear isn't weakness. Fear is a survival tool. Our ancestors, who had a healthy fear of darkness, who were cautious when moving at night, who stayed alert to strange sounds, these were the ones who survived to pass their genes forward. So yes, we're afraid of the dark. Children are afraid of the dark, and it's not because they're silly or weak. It's because for hundreds of thousands of years, those who respected darkness lived longer. But the fascinating thing is that we didn't just fear. We learned, we adapted. We found ways not just to survive the night, but to use the night. Hunters learned that certain animals became slower or confused at night. They learned that the full moon offered enough light for certain types of hunting. They learned that the coolness of night was better for traveling long distances in hot climates, leaving before dawn, traveling in the cool hours, resting in the midday heat. The night also offered protection from certain dangers. Some predators are nocturnal, yes, but others are diurnal. Staying quiet and hidden at night meant being invisible to these daytime hunters. And there's the question of sleep. We think sleeping 8 hours straight is natural, but archaeological evidence and studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies suggest something different. Our ancestors probably slept in phases, an initial sleep after sunset, a few hours awake in the middle of the night. That's when elders told stories, that's when couples had intimacy, that's when sentries changed shifts, and then another period of sleep until dawn. Could our modern insomnia problems be, in part, because we're trying to sleep in a way that's not natural for our species? If you're enjoying our stories, subscribe to the channel to help our community grow and receive notifications of new stories. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating for us to know where our community is around the world. The truth is that ancient darkness wasn't just a challenge to be overcome. It was an integral part of the rhythm of human life. It was when the body rested and repaired itself. It was when communities strengthened through stories and rituals. It was when the connection with the cosmos, with the stars, with the cycles of the moon, with the seasons, became viscerally real. Today we live in a world where night has been, for the most part, eliminated. We flip a switch and darkness disappears. We look at a bright screen until seconds before trying to sleep. We work night shifts as if the body hadn't been programmed for millions of years to rest when the sun sets. And maybe, just maybe, we lost something in that process. Not that artificial light is bad, it gave us safety, productivity, possibilities. But maybe it's worth asking, what did our ancestors know about the night that we've forgotten? As you settle in to sleep today, maybe in a dark room or with a soft nightlight, think about the billions of humans who came before you. Think about the countless nights where there was no choice but to accept the darkness. And think about how, in that darkness, they didn't just survive, they flourished. They created art, music, stories, religion, science. Darkness wasn't the end of human experience. In many ways, it was where the deepest human experience happened. And this is just the surface of this journey, because if we're really going to understand how night shaped humanity, we need to go deeper. We need to understand how our bodies, our eyes, our brains evolved specifically in response to that darkness. We need to understand the choices our ancestors made and the tools they created. We need to understand the gods they imagined and the fears they domesticated, because the history of humanity isn't just the history of what we did when the sun shone. It's equally the history of what we did, thought, felt, and dreamed when the sun set and darkness embraced the world. And there's something curious about this that we haven't fully explored yet. Something about how our eyes work, about what we can and cannot see in the dark, and why evolution made certain choices that made us who we are today. Eyes that learn to see in shadows. So, we left the last chapter with a curious question about our eyes. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because evolution made fascinating choices when it comes to human vision. Have you ever noticed how a cat's eyes shine in the dark when a light passes through them? That strange green or golden glow that seems almost supernatural. That's not magic. It's a structure called the tapetum lucidum, basically a mirror at the back of the eye that reflects light back through the retina, giving the photoreceptors a second chance to capture that light. It's like processing the same information twice, maximizing every available photon. It's incredibly efficient for night vision. Cats, dogs, deer, most nocturnal predators and prey have this. So why don't we have it? The answer is both simple and profound, because evolution made a different choice for us. Our primate ancestors lived in trees, in environments where color vision and depth perception were far more important than night vision. Think about it. When you're jumping from branch to branch at 15 meters high, you need to judge distances with extreme precision. You need to distinguish between a ripe fruit, red, orange, and a green one, which might make you sick. You need to see in 3 dimensions, not just in light and shadow, so our eyes evolved for something different. We sacrifice superior night vision in exchange for exceptional color vision and binocular depth perception. Our eyes are positioned at the front of the head, not on the sides like herbivores. This gives us an overlapping field of vision. Both eyes see almost the same scene, and the brain uses the small differences between the two images to calculate distance and depth. It's a trade-off. It's always a trade-off in evolution. We gain something, we lose something, but that doesn't mean our eyes are useless in darkness, far from it. They just work in a different, more subtle way. Inside your eye, you have two main types of photoreceptor cells, cones and rods. Cones are responsible for color vision and work best in bright light. You have about 6 to 7 million of them. But rods are another story. You have about 120 million of them, and they're specialized in detecting dim light. Rods are incredibly sensitive. Studies have shown that a rod can detect a single photon, the smallest possible unit of light. It's like having 120 million ultra-sensitive sensors spread across your retina, each capable of capturing the faintest glimmer of light. But there's a trick. Rods don't detect color. They only detect light versus darkness and light intensities. That's why at twilight or at night, when your rods are doing most of the work, the world seems to have fewer colors. Everything becomes more bluish, grayish. It's the world in black and white, or almost. And there's another curious detail. Rods are concentrated in the periphery of your retina, not in the center. The center, the fovea, is where you have the highest concentration of cones. It's where you see sharp details and vibrant colors in bright light. But at night, if you look directly at something faint, like a dim star, it might disappear. If you look slightly to the side, suddenly it appears again. This is called averted vision, and our ancestors knew this trick intimately. Night hunters, sentries, anyone who needed to move or observe in darkness learned not to look directly at what they wanted to see. They looked slightly to the side, using the rod-rich part of the retina to capture that faint light. Do we still use this technique today without realizing it? Try it next time you're in a dark place, but the story of our eyes in darkness isn't just about the biology of the retina. It's also about chemistry and time. When you go from a lit environment to a dark one, your eyes don't adjust instantly. It takes time. You've probably noticed this, entering a dark room from sunlight and not being able to see anything for a few seconds or minutes. This is dark adaptation, and it involves two main processes. The first is fast and mechanical. Your pupils dilate, allowing more light to enter. This happens in seconds. You can literally feel it if you pay attention. That small adjustment, like a camera opening the aperture. But the second process is slower and more fascinating. It's chemical. In your rods, there's a protein called rhodopsin, which is light sensitive. When light hits rhodopsin, it breaks down and needs to be regenerated. In bright light, rhodopsin is constantly being broken down and quickly regenerated. But when you enter darkness, your eyes begin to accumulate rhodopsin, making the rods increasingly sensitive. This process takes time, about 20 to 30 minutes for complete adaptation. After that time, your eyes can be up to 10,000 times more sensitive to light than they were in bright light. 10,000 times. Think about that. It's the difference between seeing absolutely nothing and being able to navigate reasonably well under faint starlight. Our ancestors understood this intuitively. When sentries changed shifts at night, the new sentry didn't start working immediately after leaving the area lit by the fire. They waited. They sat in the dimness, let their eyes adjust. Because going straight from light to complete darkness was being blind for long minutes, minutes that could be fatal if a predator or enemy approached. And there's another interesting detail. Red light doesn't affect rhodopsin the same way white or blue light does. That's why even today, military, sailors, astronomers, anyone who needs to maintain night vision but occasionally needs light, uses red light. It allows you to see enough to read a map or do a task, but doesn't destroy your dark adaptation. Our ancestors didn't know about rhodopsin or wavelengths of light, but some discovered versions of this trick. using the faint glow of fire embers instead of bright flames when they needed to move at night, partially covering torches. Small adaptations that made the difference between seeing and being seen. But vision is only part of the story, because when our eyes reach their limits, our brain does something extraordinary. It starts to fill in the gaps. Have you ever looked at shadows in the darkness and seen shapes that aren't there? A hanging coat that for a second looks like a person? A bush that looks like an animal? That's not a bug, it's a feature. It's your brain doing its job. In low visual information environments, that is, darkness, the brain uses past experience and context to try to make sense of the little the eyes capture. It's like the brain is saying, look, I don't have enough data here, so I'm going to make my best guess based on what I know about the world. Most of the time, this is useful. It allows you to recognize objects and navigate even when vision is imperfect. But sometimes the brain guesses wrong, and that's when we see things that don't exist. For our ancestors, this had interesting implications. On one hand, it meant they could function surprisingly well in low light. The brain compensated, filled in details, allowed pattern recognition, even with minimal visual information. On the other hand, it meant the mind could play tricks. That moving shadow could be the wind in the leaves, or it could be something more. Better to assume the worst and be wrong than assume the best and be dead. This bias, assuming danger when uncertain, became deeply ingrained in our psychology. It's part of why we still feel chills in the darkness, why children are afraid of what might be under the bed, why horror as a genre works so well. Darkness activates ancient alert systems, encoded over millions of years. Curious how something so ancient still affects us today, right? But our eyes and brain didn't work alone in ancestral darkness. They were part of an integrated sensory system where each sense compensated for the limitations of the others. And this leads us to something most people don't realize. We don't see only with our eyes, we see with the brain, and the brain uses all available senses to construct an image of the world. In darkness, when vision is limited, the brain gives more weight to other senses. Sound becomes more important. Touch becomes more important. Even smell and that vague sixth sense of presence, proprioception, spatial awareness, become more prominent. Our ancestors developed a multi-sensory awareness of the environment that most of us today have lost. They didn't just see the night when there was enough light. They felt the night, the airflow that indicated a nearby opening, the change in acoustics that indicated an open versus closed space, the growing humidity that signaled proximity to water. These weren't superpowers, it was just attention, it was training, it was necessity. And there's something else worth exploring. While our eyes have limitations in darkness compared to truly nocturnal animals, we have a huge advantage in another aspect. We can switch. Most animals are specialized. True nocturnals have excellent night vision but relatively poor daytime vision. True diurnals have the opposite. But humans? We're crepuscular and flexible. We function reasonably well both day and night. We're not the best at either extreme, but we're competent at both. And in an unpredictable world, flexibility is worth more than extreme specialization. This flexibility extends beyond vision. Our sleep patterns, our physiology, our psychology, all of this shows signs of a species that needed to function in multiple light conditions. We're not completely diurnal like a squirrel, nor completely nocturnal like an owl. We're in the middle, able to adapt as necessary. And this adaptability, this ability to function in both light and shadow, may have been one of our greatest evolutionary advantages. While specialized predators were limited to their time windows, we could hunt by day, gather at dusk, travel at night under the moon, work at dawn. We had access to 24 hours, not just 12. So yes, we don't have eyes that shine in the dark. We can't see in total darkness like a cat. But our eyes, working with our incredibly adaptable brain, gave us something different: versatility. And over time, we didn't just accept the limitations of our night vision. We found ways to compensate for them, to extend them, to transcend them. Because while our eyes had limits, our ingenuity didn't. And the first great extension of our senses in darkness didn't come from biological evolution. It came from technological innovation. It came from fire. The awakening of other senses. So, we ended the last chapter talking about fire, and we'll get there. But before exploring how technology extended our senses, it's worth understanding how extraordinary those senses already were, especially when vision was compromised by darkness. Close your eyes again, just for a moment, and pay attention to the world around you now. What do you hear? Maybe the hum of an electronic device, maybe distant traffic, maybe wind or rain, or almost complete silence. Now imagine that this is your primary sense of navigation, not a backup, not a complement, but the main way to understand the space around you. For our ancestors on a moonless night without fire, in unfamiliar territory, hearing wasn't just important. It was survival. And what's fascinating is that human hearing, when truly utilized, is far more sophisticated than most of us realize today. You have two ears, one on each side of your head. This isn't an accident, it's precise evolutionary design. Those few centimeters of distance between your ears allow your brain to do something called binaural localization, basically triangulate the origin of a sound with impressive precision. It works like this. A sound coming from your right reaches your right ear a fraction of a second before reaching the left. We're talking microseconds, differences so small you don't consciously notice, but your brain notices. Additionally, the sound is slightly louder in the closer ear because your head creates a sound shadow that attenuates the sound for the farther ear. Using these two pieces of information, time difference and intensity difference, your brain can determine not just which direction the sound comes from, but approximately how far away it is. It's unconscious geometry happening thousands of times per second. And that's just the beginning. The shape of your ears, those strange folds and curves, isn't random. Each ridge, each depression, subtly modifies how sound waves from different directions enter the ear canal. Sounds coming from above have a different signature than sounds coming from below. Sounds coming from the front sound slightly different from sounds coming from behind. Your brain learned these signatures from the moment you were born, and now uses them automatically to create a three-dimensional sound map of the world around you. But here's the trick. Most of us today never really developed this sense to its maximum potential because we never needed to. We live in visual environments. We depend on our eyes for almost everything. Our ancestors didn't have that luxury. For someone living 50,000 years ago, the ability to hear a branch breaking 30 meters away and know instantly, that was something big coming from that direction, moving at that speed. That wasn't a special skill, it was normal, it was expected. It was the difference between eating and being eaten, between safety and danger, and it wasn't just about detecting sounds, it was about interpreting sounds. The crack of a dry branch sounds different from the crack of a green branch. The movement of a large animal through dry vegetation creates a different rhythmic pattern from the movement of several small animals. Wind in the leaves of a broadleaf tree sounds different from wind in pine trees. These distinctions seem trivial today, but for those who lived from the land, on the land, with the land, these sounds told complete stories. An experienced hunter could hear running water and know not just the direction, but the type of flow. Large river, small stream, distant waterfall. Each had its characteristic acoustics. They could hear an animal's call and know not just what species it was, but its emotional state: alert, relaxed, mating, fear. Because animal vocalizations change subtly based on context, they could hear other humans approaching and make judgments about intent based on the rhythm of footsteps, the care or carelessness of movement, the associated sounds, casual conversation versus cautious silence. And you, what do you think about this? Leave your thoughts in the comments when you have a moment. But hearing was just one of the senses that flourished in darkness. Let's talk about smell. We kind of underestimate smell today. It's seen almost as a luxury sense. Perfume, food, flowers. Pleasant, but not essential. But that's a very modern, very visual perspective. For our ancestors, smell was critical information transmitted through air. The human nose can detect trillions of different odors, trillions, and certain molecules can be detected at incredibly low concentrations, some at just parts per trillion. It's chemical level sensitivity allowing you to taste the air around you. And in darkness, when you can't see, smell becomes a form of remote vision. Water has a smell. Not pure water perhaps, but water in nature, or with algae, minerals, life. You can smell a river, a lake, a swamp, each with its distinct chemical signature. And with the right wind, you can smell them from kilometers away. Animals have smell. Large herbivores, deer, bison, elephants, leave an olfactory trail. Predators too, but different. Feces, urine, scent glands. All of this transmits information. And a trained nose can distinguish not just species, but how recent the smell is, how many individuals, even direction of movement based on where the smell is strongest. Fire has a smell. And not just the fire you lit yourself. Wood smoke travels long distances, especially at night when the air is calmer and stratified. You can smell a camp kilometers away. And different woods burn with slightly different smells. Useful information about what type of environment that group is traveling through. Even human emotions have a smell. This isn't just folklore. Modern studies have confirmed that humans release different chemical compounds when they're afraid, stressed, happy, sexually excited. We don't consciously notice most of the time, but our brain processes it. It's part of the subconscious chemical communication that still happens between humans. Imagine a group around a fire at night. You can't see faces well in the dim, dancing light, but you can sense the group's mood in other ways. Body language? Yes. Voice tones, of course, but also subtly the collective smell of relaxation versus tension. Do we still pick up on these chemicals today, even without realizing? That feeling that something's wrong in a social situation. Could it be more literal than we think? And then there's touch. The most underestimated sense of all, perhaps because it's so distributed, so constant that we usually ignore it. But your skin is a massive sensory organ. It's the largest organ of your body. And every square centimeter is equipped with receptors that detect pressure, vibration, temperature, pain, texture. In darkness, touch becomes an extension of spatial awareness. Your bare feet on the ground tell you a story. Sand? You're near water or in a sandy area, packed earth, well-used trail or trampled ground near a camp. Stone? What type? Smooth from water flow, rough and angular from recent break, polished by countless feet over years. Vegetation? Grass, moss, fallen leaves, each with its texture and implications about the environment. Air temperature against your skin tells you about geography. Cooler air flows downward, so a sudden cold breeze can indicate a slope, a valley, a depression. Warmer air rising can indicate a hillside or heat retained by stones that absorbed sun during the day. Humidity on skin, the sticky feeling of humid air versus the dryness of desert air, tells you about climate and proximity to water and vibration. Vibration is fascinating. Your feet can detect vibrations through the ground. Not just the obvious, a herd of animals running, but more subtle things, the rhythm of someone walking in the distance, transmitted through the earth. Even the distant roar of falling water can be felt as vibration before being heard, if you're paying attention. Some indigenous groups developed this to an art form. Aboriginal Australian hunters could track prey by putting their ear to the ground, using the earth as an amplifier to pick up vibrations. North American Plains natives did something similar, lying on the ground to hear herds of bison that were still beyond the visual horizon. This sounds like a superpower, but it's not. It's just attention, it's training, it's necessity developing capacity. And there's a sense we don't always categorize as a sense, but which is fundamental, proprioception, or spatial body awareness. Close your eyes now and touch your nose with your index finger. Did you do it? Of course you did. You didn't need to see your hand or your face. You just knew where they were in space. That's proprioception. Now imagine this expanded, not just knowing where your body is, but developing a sense of where you are in the space around you, even without seeing. Our ancestors developed this naturally because they navigated the same territories repeatedly. You don't need light to walk through your own house in the dark. You know the layout, how many steps to the wall, where the furniture is. You have a mental map. Multiply this by a hunting or gathering territory of dozens of square kilometers, traveled on foot repeatedly in all light conditions. That mental map becomes incredibly detailed. You know where the rocks are that could twist your ankle. You know where the path narrows, where there's a drop, where a fallen tree blocks the way. And you navigate this not just with visual memory, but with whole body memory. How many steps between this landmark and that? How the ground rises or falls, how the wind usually blows in this specific valley. It was embodied knowledge, literally stored in the body, not just in the conscious brain. And all these senses didn't work in isolation. They integrated. The brain wove information from vision when available, hearing, smell, touch, proprioception, even taste. Yes, you can taste some smells, into a unified perception of the environment. Neuroscientists call this multisensory integration, and the human brain is exceptionally good at it. For example, you hear a sound coming from your left. You automatically feel an impulse to turn your head in that direction. Why? Because the brain is integrating hearing with the vestibular system, balance and spatial orientation, and preparing neck muscles. This happens before you consciously decide to turn your head, or you see rapid movement in your periphery. Instantly, your body tenses, your breathing changes, your hearing seems to sharpen. The brain, detecting potential danger via vision, pre-activated all other sensory systems to collect more information quickly. This integration was even more refined in our ancestors because they depended on it constantly. In darkness, you didn't wait for one sense to give you the complete answer. You used all simultaneously, each contributing its part of the puzzle. Hear a strange sound? Check smell. Is there an associated odor? Feel vibration in the ground? Notice change in air temperature? All information processed in milliseconds, resulting in an almost instinctive understanding. Danger, opportunity, or neutral. This seems esoteric, even mystical. But it wasn't. It was just biology functioning at its best, without the interference of technology that today allows us to ignore most of these signals. There's something we lose when we stop paying attention. Not just practical information, but a form of connection with the environment. Our ancestors didn't see nature as something separate from them. They were immersed in it, constantly in sensory dialogue with the world around them. Each breeze, each sound, each smell was a word in that conversation, and they were fluent in the language. Us today, we kind of forgot how to speak it. We put on headphones and block out sounds, We stay in temperature-controlled environments and lose connection with climate. But we look at screens and ignore the three-dimensional world around us. It's not criticism, it's just observation. We gained a lot with technology, but we also lost something. A form of attention, a form of presence, a form of sensory belonging to the world. And maybe that's why so many people today seek experiences like camping, nature hikes, sensory meditation. There's something deeply satisfying about reconnecting with these more basic, more ancient senses. It's almost like coming home after a long journey. Your body recognizes it. Your ancestral brain wakes up a bit. And while the darkness of night forced our ancestors to develop these non-visual senses, there was something they created that would change everything. A technology so fundamental, so transformative, that it would permanently alter humanity's relationship with the night. And that technology, bright and dancing, smoking and crackling, was about to give humanity the first real control over the darkness that had reigned unchallenged for millions of years. The first flame. Imagine the first time a human held fire in their hands, not accidentally, not fleeing from it, but controlling it, carrying it, keeping it alive. It must have been terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Fire isn't like other tools, a chipped stone, a shaped piece of wood. These things are predictable, inert, obedient. But fire is alive in a strange way. It breathes oxygen. It grows, it moves, it has appetite. It can help you or destroy you depending on how well you understand it. And at some point in our evolutionary history, probably more than 1 million years ago, although the evidence is debated, some of our ancestors crossed a crucial boundary. They stopped just finding fire occasionally after lightning or natural fires. They began to keep it, to feed it, to transport it from place to place, and eventually to create it from nothing. This was possibly the greatest technological revolution in human history, greater than the wheel, greater than agriculture, greater than the internet, if we're being honest, because fire fundamentally changed what it meant to be human. And nowhere was this change more profound than at night. Before controlled fire, night was the territory of other creatures. Humans could survive in it, yes, with the sharpened senses we've already explored, but we were fundamentally vulnerable. We hid, stayed quiet, waited for dawn. With fire, night became ours. Let's think about what fire does at the most basic level. It creates light. Not the diffuse cold light of stars and moon, but bright, dancing, warm light. Light that pushes darkness back, creating a bubble of visibility in an ocean of darkness. The range of that light determined the range of the safe world. On a clear night, a well-fed fire can be seen kilometers away as a bright point. Up close, it illuminates a circle of maybe 5 to 10 meters with reasonable clarity, depending on the fire's size. And in that circle, nighttime life was transformed. Suddenly you could see faces, read expressions, work with your hands, repair tools, prepare food, make crafts. Activities that were impossible or dangerous in total darkness became possible again. But light was just the beginning. Fire produces heat, radiant heat that penetrates the body, relaxes tense muscles, dries wet clothes. In cold climates, and our ancestors lived through ice ages, fire meant the difference between life and death. Nights that would have been unbearable, even fatal, became tolerable, even comfortable. And with heat came geographic expansion. Suddenly, colder regions further north or at higher altitudes became habitable. Humanity was no longer restricted to tropical and subtropical zones. The whole world opened up as a possibility. Fire also cooks, and cooking is perhaps underestimated as an innovation. Cooked food is safer. Parasites and bacteria die with heat. It's more digestible, tough fibers break down, proteins denature in ways that facilitate digestion. It's more nutritious, in a practical sense. You extract more calories and nutrients from cooked food than raw. Some anthropologists argue that cooking was essential for the evolution of the large human brain. Brains are energetically expensive. The human brain uses about 20% of the body's calories, despite being only 2% of body weight. Getting more calories from foods through cooking may have provided the energy surplus necessary to sustain larger brains. But beyond these practical functions, fire did something more, something social, something psychological. It created a center. Think about the basic physics of a campfire. It's a fixed point, and humans naturally organize around it. We sit in a circle, all facing the fire, but also seeing each other through the dancing flames. It's no coincidence that campfires became centers of social life, of ritual, of narrative. It's around the fire that stories were told. And not just any stories, the most important ones: creation myths, stories of ancestors, survival lessons disguised as adventures. Fire didn't just illuminate faces, it created an atmosphere. The flickering light made shadows dance. Faces seemed more expressive, more dramatic. The very physics of fire made narrative more engaging. And there's something about firelight specifically, not electric light but real flames, that affects the human brain. Modern studies show that looking at fire reduces blood pressure, slows heart rate, promotes alpha brain waves associated with relaxation. It's almost meditative. Did our ancestors feel this too? Were the long nights around the fire, in part, collective forced relaxation sessions? There's something deeply ritualistic about maintaining a campfire. You need to feed it constantly. Add wood, not too much at once, or you smother the flames, not too little, or it dies. Adjust the logs to maximize airflow, protect from rain and wind. It's active work, but work that allows contemplation. And keeping the fire at night was a critical responsibility. We talked before about night sentries, but sentries did more than just watch for dangers. They kept the fire. It was a dual task, protection and preservation, because letting the fire die wasn't just losing light and heat. Before reliable methods of creating fire from scratch, and those methods came later and required considerable skill, losing fire meant going without until you could find a natural source or steal it from another group. So fire was treated almost like a living member of the group. It was fed, protected, carefully carried when the group moved. Some cultures even developed stories where fire was literally alive, a spirit or god that needed to be cared for and respected. And there's truth in that metaphor, isn't there? Fire has behavior. It behaves differently depending on fuel. Dry wood burns fast and hot. Green wood burns slow and smoky. Different woods have different smells, produce embers of different quality. Fire in strong wind versus sheltered fire in a cave versus fire in light rain. Each situation requires knowledge and adjustment. Mastering fire was specialized knowledge. And it's likely that in ancestral groups some people became experts. The firekeepers, those particularly skilled at starting it, keeping it, controlling it. Social status may have flowed from these skills. After all, you control fire, you control the difference between bearable night and miserable night. But fire wasn't just comfort. It was also defense. Most animals have an instinctive fear of fire. It makes evolutionary sense. Fire in nature usually means forest fire, danger, flight. Only humans eventually learned that fire could be small, contained, useful. So a campfire at night created a psychological barrier for predators. Not absolute. Some exceptionally hungry or bold predators could overcome that fear. But significant. The lit zone around the fire became a zone of relative safety. This dramatically changed the equation of nighttime survival. Instead of depending totally on natural shelters, caves, rock fissures, trees, humans could camp in more open spaces. This offered tremendous flexibility for migration, for exploration, for adaptation to new environments. And there's an interesting detail. Fire also affects predators at a distance. Smoke has a strong smell that travels far. Light can be seen from kilometers away, so fire not only defended locally, but announced presence. Humans here, many humans with fire. It was a sign of strength, of numbers, of technology. Of course, this had a downside too. If you wanted to hide, fire betrayed you. But in most situations, the benefits outweighed the risks. And as humans became more numerous and more dominant, fire shifted from defense against predators to a tool of communication between groups. Seeing smoke or firelight in the distance told you where other humans were. Depending on context, this was useful information: trade, alliance, shared territory, or warning of potential competition. Now, eventually, and this probably took hundreds of thousands of years after initial domestication of fire, humans discovered how to create fire from scratch. Not carry embers from camp to camp, but start a new flame when needed. Methods varied, but the two main ones were friction and percussion. Friction, the rubbing two sticks method everyone jokes about, but which is surprisingly difficult, involves rapidly rotating one piece of wood against another. Friction generates heat. Enough heat in a wood powder that accumulates can create an ember. This ember, carefully transferred to easily flammable material like dry grass or shredded bark, can be gently blown until it creates flame. Sounds simple. In practice, it requires specific technique, physical endurance, right materials, right conditions. Too much humidity and it doesn't work. Wrong type of wood and it doesn't work. Wrong technique and you just tire yourself out. Percussion, striking stone against stone or stone against natural iron to create sparks, is in some ways more reliable but requires specific materials. Flint is the most famous material, but it's not available everywhere. Mastering these methods was an important milestone. It meant fire was no longer a rare and precious resource to be zealously guarded. It was something you could create on demand, at least in favorable conditions. But even with the ability to create fire, maintaining it was preferable. Why? Because creating fire, even with skill, takes time and effort. It's much easier to keep embers alive than to start from scratch every time. So groups developed techniques to transport fire. Embers in insulated containers, torches, methods to keep small flames lit during travels. Fire also allowed something that's easy to overlook, but was psychologically significant: extension of the day. Before fire, the useful day was literally determined by sunlight. When the sun set, activity largely ceased. You could do some things in the dark with skillful hands and memory, but options were limited. With fire, suddenly you had extra hours. Not as good as daylight, but enough. You could work. You could socialize. You could teach skills to children. You could plan, discuss, decide as a group. These extra hours might not seem like much, but added up over months and years. They represented a massive expansion of time available for cultural development, for innovation, for knowledge transmission, and there's something else. Fire altered circadian rhythms, the natural cycles of sleep and wakefulness. Without artificial light, you tend to sleep shortly after sunset and wake with dawn, perhaps with a period awake in the middle of the night. With fire, these patterns became more flexible. You could choose to stay awake longer or sleep at different times. Not completely, the body still responded to natural cycles, but there was more flexibility. Was this the first time humans began to feel they had control over time, not just over space? And as human groups became more sophisticated, the use of fire at night became more elaborate. Not just one campfire, but several strategically positioned. Torches to illuminate paths, larger fires for rituals, smaller fires for specific work. Eventually, much later in human history, fire would become even more controlled. Oil lamps, candles, lanterns. each innovation pushing darkness a bit further back, creating ever larger bubbles of human light in the night. But that first controlled fire, the first campfire deliberately kept alive night after night, that was the turning point. That was when humans stopped accepting night as an inevitable enemy and began transforming it into usable space. And with that transformation came profound change in the human psyche. Night was still powerful, still mysterious, still demanded respect. But it was no longer completely frightening. It was no longer entirely the territory of others. It was ours too, partially, conditionally, but undeniably. And this claiming of the night, this extension of human domain beyond daylight hours, may have been as important as any other achievement in our evolutionary journey. It gave us time. It gave us safety. It gave us the literal and psychological space to become what we are today. But with all that light, with all that protection, there were things about the night that fire didn't change. There were still the long hours between waking moments. There was still the act of sleeping itself, of surrendering consciousness to darkness for hours on end. And it was in those moments, those states, that night continued to shape humanity in profound and surprising ways. The silent rhythm of the body. So, we talked about how fire extended the day, how it created flexibility in time. But there's something that not even fire could completely change: the internal rhythm of the human body. That silent biological clock that keeps ticking night after night, generation after generation, for millions of years. We call this circadian rhythm, from the Latin circadian, meaning approximately a day. And that's exactly what it is. A cycle of approximately 24 hours that governs almost all physiological processes of the body. But here's the curious thing. This rhythm isn't learned. You're not born and learn to be sleepy when it gets dark. You're born with it already programmed in your DNA. It's as fundamental to human biology as breathing, as digesting food. And when you understand how this rhythm worked in our ancestors, how it synchronized perfectly with the natural cycles of light and darkness, you begin to realize how deeply connected we were, and still are, biologically, to the ancestral night. Let's start with the basics. In your brain, there's a small structure called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. You don't need to memorize the name, you just need to know it's basically the body's master clock. It has about 20,000 specialized neurons whose only function is to keep biological time. This clock works on its own. Experiments have shown that if you put someone in an environment completely without time cues, no natural light, no clocks, no fixed schedules, the body still maintains a cycle of approximately 24 hours. Sometimes it's a bit longer, like 24.2 or 24.5 hours, but always close to 24. But here's the trick. This clock needs to be synchronized. Without external signals, it tends to drift a bit. And the most powerful synchronizer? Light. Specifically natural sunlight. It works like this. You have special cells in the retina, different from the cones and rods we already talked about. These cells contain a protein called melanopsin, and they're specifically sensitive to blue light, the type of light the sun produces abundantly during the day. When these cells detect blue light, they send signals directly to the master clock in the brain. It's day, adjust the clock, and the clock responds by orchestrating changes throughout the body. Body temperature rises, production of cortisol, alert hormone, increases. Metabolism accelerates. You become biologically prepared to be awake, active, alert. When light diminishes when the sun sets, the absence of these blue light signals triggers a different cascade. The pineal gland, a small, deep structure in the brain, begins to produce melatonin. And melatonin is basically the chemical messenger that tells the body it's night, time to slow down, time to prepare for sleep. This doesn't knock you out instantly. It's not anesthesia. but it creates biological conditions that facilitate sleep. Body temperature begins to drop slightly, metabolism slows, brain activity shifts from alert patterns to more relaxed patterns. And here's what's fascinating. This system was calibrated over millions of years of evolution to synchronize with Earth's natural cycles of light and darkness, not with artificial light, with the sun. For our ancestors, this meant that their body naturally woke when the sun rose or shortly before. Actually, melatonin production drops in the hours before dawn, preparing the body to wake. And naturally began to get sleepy when the sun set and darkness fell. There was no alarm. There was no caffeine to force artificial alertness. There were no bright screens tricking the brain into thinking it was still day. It was just the natural rhythm of the planet synchronized with the natural rhythm of the body. Think about it. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in perfect synchrony with the day-night cycle. And then, in the last 150 years, an evolutionary blink, we invented electric light and began ignoring these signals. Could this explain part of the modern epidemic of sleep problems? Because here's the reality. Light at night, especially blue light from screens, suppresses melatonin production. Your brain receives confusing signals. Is it day? Is it night? I don't know anymore. The internal clock tries to adjust, but it's fighting against contradictory environmental signals. And when the circadian rhythm is disrupted, it's not just sleep that suffers, it's everything. Metabolism, immune system, mood, cognition, all of this is regulated by circadian cycles. Deregulating the master clock has cascading effects throughout the body. But let's go back to our ancestors, because there's more to their sleep story than just going to sleep when it gets dark. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups that still live similarly to our distant ancestors, reveal interesting sleep patterns. They don't sleep 8 hours straight. In fact, sleep in one long, uninterrupted session may be more the exception than the rule. What researchers observed is something called biphasic or even polyphasic sleep. It works roughly like this. You sleep a few hours after sunset, maybe 3 to 4 hours. Then you wake naturally. You stay awake for an hour or two in the middle of the night. Then you sleep again for another 3 to 4 hours until dawn. And this waking period in the middle of the night isn't insomnia. It's not a problem. It's a normal pattern for many of these groups. What do they do during these waking periods? Various things. Feed the fire. Change sentry shifts. Have intimate activities with partners. Actually, this was probably the time of greatest privacy when others were sleeping. Talk in low voices, reflect, daydream, and the elders. These nighttime periods were when they told stories to younger generations. It wasn't casual entertainment, it was transmission of vital knowledge. In the quiet of night, with fewer distractions, the young mind absorbed survival lessons, tribal history, cultural values. There's even historical evidence of this in more recent periods. Medieval and Renaissance European writings frequently mention first sleep and second sleep, with a waking period in between. It was considered normal, even common. Only with industrialization and artificial lighting did this change to the modern expectation of continuous sleep. Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is a fascinating part of this journey. But let's go deeper, because sleep isn't just being unconscious, it's an active, complex, essential process. Sleep has stages. You start in light sleep, progress to deep sleep, then enter something called REM sleep, rapid eye movement. And this cycle repeats several times during the night, each cycle lasting about 90 minutes. Each stage has a function. Deep sleep is when the body does most of its physical repair. Muscles recover, tissues regenerate, immune system does maintenance. It's restorative sleep in the most literal sense. REM sleep is where emotional processing and memory consolidation happen. It's when you dream vividly. And curiously, during REM sleep, your body becomes basically paralyzed. Except for the muscles that move the eyes, and those that control breathing. This paralysis probably evolved to prevent you from physically acting out your dreams, which would be dangerous. And there's something interesting about sleep in natural environments versus modern environments. Studies show that in environments without artificial light, people tend to have more deep sleep early in the night and more REM sleep and dreams in the hours before dawn. This makes evolutionary sense. Deep sleep first means physical restoration early in the rest period. REM sleep and memory, emotional processing later prepares the brain to be awake and alert when day begins. But there's another element: temperature. Sleep is intimately linked to body temperature. Your body temperature drops naturally at night. It's part of the falling asleep process. It reaches its lowest point usually a few hours before dawn and then begins to rise again, helping you wake up. For our ancestors, especially those in colder climates, managing body temperature during sleep was critical. Sleeping too close to the fire was uncomfortable and risky. Too far, and you froze. They learned to use coverings, animal skins, blankets woven from fibers, to insulate the body, allowing internal temperature to drop to the ideal sleep range without external temperature becoming dangerously low. And sleeping in groups wasn't just security against predators, it was shared warmth. Close bodies created a warmer microclimate. Small children slept between adults, benefiting from the warmth of both sides. It was survival strategy and comfort. Have we lost something by sleeping alone in isolated rooms? Not in terms of safety, obviously, but in terms of connection, of mutual temperature regulation, of sense of community. There's also the question of vulnerability. Sleep is an incredibly vulnerable state. You're unconscious, unresponsive, defenseless. So it makes sense that groups developed systems where not everyone slept at the same time. There were always sentries, always someone awake, alert, keeping the fire, watching for dangers. This created natural shifts. And interestingly, researchers have observed that in hunter-gatherer groups, different people have different chronotypes. Some are naturally morning people, wake early, are more alert early, get sleepy early at night. And others are night people, wake late, are more alert at night, sleep late. This variation may have been evolutionarily advantageous. It means that in any group, there would naturally be some people awake at different times of night. It wasn't a planned system. It was natural biological diversity providing 24-hour coverage almost automatically. And then there are dreams. Dreams. That bizarre, mysterious, fascinating aspect of sleep that cultures throughout history have tried to understand and interpret. Our ancestors dreamed as much as we do, and without neuroscientific understanding of REM sleep, without knowledge of memory processing, how did they interpret these vivid and strange experiences that happened during sleep? Many saw them as significant, messages from spirits, from ancestors, from gods, premonitions of the future, journeys of the soul to other realms while the body rested. And it's not hard to understand why. Dreams can be incredibly vivid, more real than reality sometimes. You can fly. You can talk to dead people. You can visit places you've never seen. And then you wake up, and everything disappears like smoke. For a mind trying to understand the world without modern science, dreams were evidence that there was more to reality than the visible physical world. They were genuine experiences that required explanation. And the explanations that emerged shaped religions, mythologies, entire belief systems. Some groups developed practices of lucid dreaming, the ability to become conscious within a dream and even control it. Shamans and spiritual leaders were often those who could navigate the dream world skillfully, interpret them, use insights that supposedly came from them. Are dreams really just random memory processing, or is there wisdom in them that we today ignore? Modern science would say that dreams are mainly memory consolidation, emotional processing, reorganization of neural information. But even scientists would admit that dreams can offer insights about your fears, desires, subconscious concerns. Your sleeping brain sometimes sees connections that the conscious, logical brain misses. So maybe our ancestors were partially right. Maybe dreams are messengers not from gods but from deeper parts of ourselves. And while they slept, while they dreamed, while they rested under stars or inside dark shelters, their bodies were doing invisible but essential work. Cells divided and repaired, immune system fought pathogens, brain reorganized memories, discarded irrelevant information, strengthened important connections. Sleep wasn't wasted time. It was investment. It was necessary maintenance. It was when the body prepared to face another day of challenges. And as the first light of dawn began to tint the horizon, as body temperature rose naturally, as melatonin was suppressed and cortisol began to flow, our ancestors woke. Not with a jarring alarm, not with a start, but gradually, naturally synchronized with the sunrise that signaled the beginning of a new cycle. And this rhythm, sleep when it gets dark, wake when it gets light, wasn't just habit. It was deep biology, calibrated by millions of years of evolution, inscribed in every cell of the body. Night didn't just shape how they lived, it shaped how their bodies functioned at a fundamental level. And even today, even with all our technology and artificial light, these ancient rhythms still pulse within us, still try to guide us, still connect us to that first ancestral night when our distant ancestors slept under the stars. But the ancestral night wasn't just about biology and sleep. It was also about the spaces where people slept, about how those spaces were built and organized. And these architectural choices, these physical adaptations to darkness, reveal as much about human ingenuity as about our deepest needs for safety and shelter. Architecture of darkness. So we explored how the human body adapted to night, how sleep worked, how internal rhythms synchronized with darkness. But there's another equally fascinating aspect, how our ancestors modified the physical space around them to make night more bearable, safer, more functional, because it's one thing to adapt biologically. Another is to actively create environments that work in your favor. And that's exactly what humans did very early in our history. We built shelters, not just for protection against rain or sun, but specifically thinking about night. Let's start with the most obvious, caves. When you think of prehistoric humans, you probably imagine caves, right? And there's a reason for that. Caves were perfect natural shelters in many ways. They were already there, didn't require construction. They offered protection against elements, wind, rain, snow, and crucially, they offered protection against predators. A cave with a narrow entrance is defensible. You can post sentries at the entrance. You can light a fire there, creating a barrier of light and heat that deters animals. And inside the cave, you have solid rock walls that no predator can breach. But living in caves presented unique challenges related to darkness. Think about a typical cave entrance. There's natural light near the opening, of course. But as you go deeper, darkness becomes absolute. And we're talking about darkness different from night outdoors. No stars, no moon, not the faintest glow on the horizon. It's total, complete, impenetrable darkness. To navigate deep in caves, you needed artificial light. Torches, branches with resin or flammable materials tied on, primitive fat lamps, basically stone bowls or shells with melted animal fat and a wick. These technologies allowed exploration and use of deeper parts of caves. And there's fascinating evidence of this. Cave paintings, some of the oldest known art, found at depths where natural light never reaches. Our ancestors brought artificial light, flickering torches, fat lamps, to these deep, dark spaces to create art. Imagine this for a moment. You're 30,000 years in the past, holding a torch, descending a narrow rock tunnel into the earth. Your torchlight dances on the walls, creating moving shadows. The air is cold, damp, smells of earth and stone. You hear only your own footsteps, your own breathing, maybe the distant dripping of water. And then you stop. And on the smooth rock wall you begin to draw. Bison, horses, stenciled hands made by blowing pigment around your hand pressed against the stone. Why? For what purpose? We still debate this. Ritual, art, hunting magic, territorial mapping, maybe all of these things. But the point is, they mastered the cave's darkness. They transformed it into usable space through artificial light. Of course, not everyone lived in caves. Caves are only available in certain geographies, areas with appropriate limestone rock formations. So what other options existed? Built shelters. And here the diversity is fascinating because different cultures in different environments developed very different solutions. On open plains where there were no caves or sufficient trees, some groups built shelters from bones and hides. Mammoth bones, specifically. These enormous animals provided not just food but building materials. Large bones served as framework, creating a dome or conical shape. Hides were stretched over the structure to create walls and roof. These shelters were surprisingly efficient. The hide walls blocked wind. The dome shape distributed weight evenly, making the structure stable. And inside, with fire at the center and heat from people, temperature could be kept tolerable even in extremely cold climates. But think about the night inside this type of shelter. No windows, there was no glass, so openings meant heat loss. This means that when it got dark, the interior became dark, completely dark unless there was fire. Fire then wasn't just a heat source, it was literally the only light source. When the fire burned strong, you could see faces, hands, the immediate interior of the shelter. When the fire diminished to embers, you saw only the red-orange glow of embers and vague shadows. And this created a specific atmosphere, forced intimacy. Everyone in the small space, lit only by central fire. There was no real privacy. There were no dark corners to hide in. It was communal life by necessity. In forests, solutions were different. Wood was abundant, so structures were generally made from branches, logs, bark. People built everything from simple lean-tos, basically a slanted roof leaning against trees or a branch framework, to more elaborate structures with more complex walls and roofs. These forest shelters had the advantage of being surrounded by trees, which offered additional protection against wind and created a sense of enclosure, of security. But it also meant that at night the surrounding forest was dark, full of sounds, branches cracking, animals moving, wind in leaves. For someone sleeping in a forest shelter, night was an auditory experience as much as visual. You heard the forest alive around you, and your brain was constantly evaluating, is this sound normal? Is this sound danger? Is it just the wind? Is it a harmless animal? Is it a predator? And in coastal areas or near rivers, there was another solution: stilt houses. Structures built on stilts elevated above the ground or even over water. Stilt houses offered unique advantages. Elevation meant protection against floods, against terrestrial predators, against ground moisture. And over water, even more security. Most predators avoid swimming, especially at night, but imagine the nighttime experience in a stilt house. You're suspended in air or over dark water. Below you, maybe you hear the soft sound of water lapping at the stilts. Around you, darkness. The structure sways slightly with wind or with movement of people inside. It must have been both calming, you're safe, elevated, protected, and slightly unsettling. Especially on stormy nights when wind makes the structure creak and the water below churns. But all these different forms of shelter had something in common. They transformed the experience of night. They created a controlled microenvironment where humans could feel relatively safe, where they could sleep with less anxiety, where they could protect the most vulnerable, children, elderly, sick. And over time, shelter architecture became more sophisticated, not just basic protection, but intentional design thinking about comfort, efficiency, even aesthetics. Some cultures developed ventilation openings, small holes near the top of structures that allowed fire smoke to escape without letting too much heat out. This improved air quality inside the shelter and reduced the risk of smoke inhalation. Others developed internal partitions, not complete walls, but divisions that created semi-privacy, separating sleeping areas from work areas, or creating separate spaces for different families within a larger communal shelter. And there were orientation considerations. Which direction should the entrance face? Away from prevailing winds to avoid cold wind entering directly. Facing east, perhaps, to capture the first sunlight at dawn, warming the interior earlier. Near a water source, but not so close that floods were a risk. These choices seem simple, but they made an enormous difference in how habitable a shelter was, especially during long winter nights. And there's the social aspect of shelter construction. It wasn't an individual task, it was a community effort. Building a mammoth bone structure required several people. Collecting enough branches and bark for a forest shelter was group work. Erecting stilt houses required coordination and combined strength, so the very act of creating shelter strengthened social bonds. It was necessary cooperation. And once built, the shelter became shared space, a place where the group gathered at night, where stories were told, where children learned, where culture was transmitted. Have we lost something of this in modern architecture? Houses designed for isolated nuclear families, thick walls that completely block sounds and presence of neighbors, individual rooms where each person sleeps alone. Not that there aren't enormous benefits in modern privacy and comfort, but maybe there are trade-offs we don't even notice. Less communal connection, less group awareness, less of that sense of we're all in this together that was forced by physical necessity in ancestral times. And as shelters became more sophisticated, interior and exterior began to feel like different worlds, especially at night. Outside, darkness, cold or heat depending on climate, sounds of nature, potential danger, the vast unknown. Inside, firelight, warmth, familiar sounds of people, relative safety, the known and controlled world. This boundary, the shelter wall, the entrance that could be covered with hide or blocked with branches, wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It was the line between wild and domesticated, between chaos and order, between fear and comfort. And crossing this boundary had meaning. Leaving the shelter at night was a conscious decision, usually made only by necessity. Sentry needing to make rounds, someone needing to relieve themselves, emergency. It wasn't casual, it was deliberate, and often accompanied by heightened caution. Returning to the shelter after being outside in darkness was a return to safety, and there must have been something deeply satisfying about it, that moment of relief when you cross the entrance, when firelight envelops you, when you're surrounded again by known people in known space. We still feel echoes of this today. That feeling of arriving home at night, locking the door, turning on the lights. It's the same fundamental impulse, creating a bubble of safety and light against external darkness. And over time, as generations passed, certain places became significant. A cave shelter used by many generations accumulated layers of history. Ashes from 1,000 fires, tools left and replaced, marks on walls, maybe paintings. These places became more than just physical shelter. They became home in the deepest sense. Places with memory, with history, with ancestral connection. And these places, especially at night, must have had a special atmosphere. Not just the current fire, but the memories of all past fires. Not just the present people, but the almost spectral presence of all those who came before. Did our ancestors feel this? Did they have a sense of continuity, of being part of something larger than their own individual lives? Evidence suggests yes. Sites were reused for generations. Certain cave shelters show occupation, extending for tens of thousands of years. This isn't accident, it's choice, it's tradition. And at night, in these ancient caves or these traditional shelters, when fire burned and shadows danced, and the outside world was dark and distant, maybe there was a sense of connection, not just with the living around the fire, but with all those who had sat exactly there, generation after generation, night after night, telling similar stories, facing similar fears, finding similar comfort in light and warmth and company. Night created the need for shelter, and shelter, in turn, shaped how night was experienced, no longer fully exposed to elements and dangers, but mediated through walls, through fire, through structure that humans had created with their own hands. And this leads us to another aspect of ancestral night, because shelter solved part of the equation, having a safe place to return to. But what about moving in the night? What about using the night actively, not just surviving it passively? Because not all nighttime activity was possible or desirable within the confines of a shelter. Hunters under the stars. So, we established that shelters were the safe haven, the place to return when night fell. But the ancestral night wasn't just about hiding and waiting for dawn. For some, night was opportunity. It was a resource. It was when certain types of work became not just possible, but ideal, and perhaps no nighttime activity was as significant as hunting. Now, before we continue, let's clarify something. Night hunting wasn't the norm for most ancestral human groups. Hunting during the day, when you can see clearly, when you can coordinate with other hunters using visual signals, when you can track footprints and signs on the ground. That was generally preferable, but there were circumstances where night offered unique advantages. And groups that mastered these techniques had access to resources others didn't. First, let's talk about the moon, because the moon made all the difference between navigable night and impossible night. Full moon, that big, round, bright moon illuminating the night sky, isn't just beautiful, it's functional. Full moonlight can be surprisingly intense, not as bright as day, obviously, but enough to see silhouettes clearly, to navigate familiar terrain, to distinguish shapes at reasonable distances. Our ancestors tracked lunar phases obsessively, not as abstract astronomical curiosity, but as practical planning tool. Full moon meant opportunities. It meant night travels were possible. It meant certain types of hunting became viable. And here's something interesting. Many animals also respond to the moon. Some become more active on full moon nights. Others become more cautious. Understanding these patterns was part of any experienced hunter's knowledge. Deer, for example, tend to forage more actively during full moon because they too can see better and detect predators more easily. This makes them more confident to leave dense cover areas. For a human hunter, this meant opportunities, but also meant prey was more alert. So full moon hunting became a game of patience and strategy. You couldn't just approach carelessly. You had to use every advantage, wind in the right direction so your scent didn't reach the prey, approach from an angle where shadows hid you, slow and deliberate movement that didn't create sounds or sudden motions. And there's another factor. Temperature. Nights, especially in hot climates, are much cooler than days. For humans doing physical effort, walking long distances, carrying equipment, tracking, the nighttime coolness was an enormous advantage. You could move farther for longer without heat exhaustion. Some desert cultures developed patterns where most movement happened at night or in the cooler hours of dawn and dusk. The midday heat was for resting, for sheltering. Night was for working, but night hunting wasn't just about seeing prey, it was about not being seen. And here, darkness became an ally. Many animals that humans hunted, herbivores especially, have vision adapted to detect movement. They may not see sharp details, but they detect movement very well. It's a defense mechanism against predators, but in partial darkness, especially if you move slowly and use natural cover, trees, rocks, vegetation, you can become almost invisible. Your movement gets lost in the general movement of shadows, of swaying leaves, of ambiguous shapes. And this is where those non-visual senses we explored earlier became crucial. You couldn't rely only on eyes. You listened, the direction of prey sounds, the distance, whether it was relaxed or alert. You smelled. The wind told you if you were upwind or downwind of prey. You felt. The texture of ground under your feet told you if you were stepping on something that would make noise. It was multisensory hunting. It was using the entire human sensory toolkit in an integrated way. And when the hunt was successful, night offered another advantage: coolness. Meat deteriorates quickly in heat. But in the cooler nighttime temperature, you had more time to process the kill, to transport it back to camp before deterioration became a problem. But not all night hunting was about large terrestrial animals. There was also night fishing. Many fish are more active at night, especially in shallow waters near shore or in rivers, and certain fishing methods worked better in the dark. Torches could be used to attract fish. Light curiously attracted certain species which could then be caught with spears or nets. And there was nighttime gathering. Certain plants, certain insects, certain small animals were more accessible at night. Knowing these nighttime resources dramatically expanded available food options. If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. But beyond hunting and gathering, there was another critical use of night: long-distance navigation. Because if you're going to travel long distances, seasonal migration, trade, exploration of new territories, you need ways to know where you are and where you're going. During the day, you can use terrestrial landmarks, mountains, rivers, distinctive trees. But at night, you look up. The night sky was literally humanity's first map, and a map that was available every night, everywhere, to anyone who knew how to read it. Let's start with the most obvious: the North Star, or Polaris. In the Northern Hemisphere, Polaris sits almost exactly above the North Pole. This means that if you can identify Polaris, you instantly know where North is. And if you know where North is, you can derive all other directions. Our ancestors learned to find Polaris using constellations around it. The Big Dipper, for example, that familiar star pattern that looks like a ladle or plough, has two pointer stars that point directly to Polaris. Find the Big Dipper, follow the pointer stars, find Polaris. North located. And in the Southern Hemisphere? There's no convenient pole star, but there are other ways. The Southern Cross, distinctive constellation, can be used to find the South Celestial Pole through a slightly more complex but equally functional method. But stellar navigation wasn't just about direction. It was also about time and season. Constellations change position in the sky throughout the night as Earth rotates. So if you know which specific constellation is in which position at what time of night, you can estimate the time just by looking at the sky. Not modern clock precision, of course, but enough to know it's early evening versus it's almost dawn. And throughout the year, different constellations are visible in different seasons. Certain constellations appear only in summer, others only in winter. So the night sky told you not just where you were and what time it was, but what time of year it was. This had enormous practical implications: when to plant, when spring constellations appear, when to expect rains, when certain stars rise or set at specific times, when to migrate following animal herds, when the sky tells you the season is changing. Astronomy wasn't abstract science, it was survival knowledge. And there's something poetic about that, isn't there? All humans, on all continents, under all different skies, looked up at night and saw patterns, and created stories about those patterns. The stories were different. Different cultures saw different figures in the same stars, where some saw a hunter, others saw an animal. Where some saw gods, others saw ancestors. But the impulse was universal, transforming random points of light into meaningful narratives. And these stories served a dual purpose. They were mnemonics, ways to remember which stars were which, how to find them, what they meant. You don't memorize abstract star positions, but you remember a story about a hunter chasing an animal across the sky, and suddenly the stars have structure, have meaning, have place in memory. And the stories were culture. They were entertainment during long nights. They were education for children. See those stars there? Let me tell you the story. And in the process of telling the story, you transmitted vital astronomical knowledge disguised as narrative. Have we lost something by separating knowledge from story, fact from narrative? Our ancestors kept them intertwined, and maybe there was wisdom in that. The moon also had its cycle: new moon, crescent, full, waning, repeating every 29.5 days approximately. This cycle was so regular, so predictable that it became a natural calendar. Many ancient cultures measured time in moons, what we'd call months. 13 moons per solar year, approximately. And certain events were timed by lunar phases. Plant during the waxing moon, harvest during the waning moon. Rituals and ceremonies scheduled to coincide with full moon or new moon. Part of this may have been superstition, but part was genuine observation that certain natural phenomena, tides, animal behavior, even plant growth, really do correlate with lunar phases. We know now that the moon affects tides through gravity. Our ancestors didn't know the mechanism, but they saw the effects and incorporated them into their practical knowledge. And beyond navigation and timekeeping, there was another aspect of the night sky: wonder, pure aesthetic and existential awe. Because think about it. You live in a world where almost everything is explainable through direct experience. Animals, you see them, hunt them, understand them. Plants, you gather them, eat them, cultivate them. Rivers, mountains, trees, all of this is tangible, accessible, comprehensible. But the stars, they're infinitely far away, unreachable. They move in regular but complex patterns. They're punctuated by occasional shooting stars, meteors streaking across the sky in seconds, or by the gradual brightness of a comet visiting for weeks or months. These phenomena demanded explanation. And in the absence of astronomical science, explanations were spiritual, mythological. Stars were spirits. They were gods. They were ascended ancestors. They were eternal witnesses of human life, looking down with interest or indifference, depending on the mythology. And occasionally, the sky did something truly spectacular. Eclipses, moon covering the sun during the day, or Earth's shadow darkening the moon at night. Auroras, curtains of colored light dancing in the sky at high latitudes. Supernovas, new stars suddenly appearing, bright enough to be seen even during the day, persisting for weeks before disappearing. These events were interpreted as omens, signs, divine communications. And given how rare and dramatic they were, it's understandable. Something that breaks the regular pattern of the sky must mean something important, right? So the night sky was simultaneously practical tool and source of spiritual wonder. It was map and mystery. It was clock and cosmos. And every clear night, our ancestors had access to this spectacle. Not occasionally, not as rare luxury, but regularly, consistently, part of the normal rhythm of life. Us today, most of us have never really seen the complete night sky. Light pollution from cities erases all stars except the brightest. And even when we travel to dark places, how many of us really stop, look up, and take time to see? There's something deeply impoverishing about that. Our ancestors lived under the skies. We live under roofs, under artificial glow that hides the stars, under layers of technology that disconnect us from that ancient and fundamental experience of looking up and marveling. But in the ancestral night, there was no choice. The sky was there every night, impossible to ignore. And so they studied it, memorized it, created systems of knowledge around it, and in the process, created culture, science, art, religion. All of this from the simple act of looking up in darkness and trying to understand what they were seeing. And as this knowledge grew, as it was passed from generation to generation, something more happened. Night became not just something to be navigated or survived, but something to be inhabited with intention, with purpose, even with a certain form of mastery. The birth of stories. So we explored how our ancestors used the night, hunting, navigating, observing the stars. But there's something more that happened on those ancient nights, something that might be as important as any physical tool or survival technique, something that made us unique as a species. They told stories, and it's no coincidence that stories and night are so deeply intertwined in human experience, because night created the perfect conditions for narrative, not just the available time, but the ideal psychological environment. Think about it. During the day, there's work to do. There's hunting, gathering, building, tool repair, food preparation. Sunlight means activity, movement, practical tasks. Your mind is focused on the immediate present, the next step, the next task. But when night falls, when you're sitting around the fire with the day's work complete, with your stomach reasonably full, with your body tired but mind still alert, that's when the mind begins to wander, to reflect, to remember, to imagine. And in a group around a campfire, in the semi-darkness where you see faces but not sharp details, where shadows dance and the outside world is dark and distant, voices become the primary focus. Not vision, voice, words, narrative, and the fire itself created perfect atmosphere. The flickering light made faces seem more expressive, more dramatic. When the storyteller gestured, hand shadows danced on cave walls or on faces around. The sound of crackling wood, the smell of smoke, the warmth on hands and face contrasting with cold on your back. All of this created a rich sensory experience that intensified immersion in the story. And without visual competition, no screens, no written text, no complex visual distractions, the story became vivid in the mind. You didn't see the story, you imagined it. And paradoxically, this made it more powerful. Your own mind painted the images, and images created by imagination can be more intense than anything seen externally. But why stories? Why not just casual conversation or silence? Because stories do something pure information doesn't. They engage emotion, they create connection. They're memorable in ways isolated facts aren't. If I tell you, don't eat that red plant with leaves in 3 parts, you may or may not remember. But if I tell you a story about how young hunter Karu ate that plant and became terribly sick, how he suffered for 3 days, how the shaman had to use rare herbs to save him, how he learned to never touch that plant again, now you'll remember. The story creates emotional and narrative hooks that fix information in memory. So stories were education. They were the method of knowledge transmission in societies without writing. Knowledge about plants and animals, about geography and navigation, about appropriate social behavior, about group history. All of this packaged in memorable narratives and stories became more elaborate with repetition. A skilled storyteller didn't just recite facts, they performed, changed voice for different characters, paused dramatically at key moments, used gestures, facial expressions, and the audience participated, reacting, responding, sometimes even singing along in repetitive parts. It was entertainment, yes, but it was much more. It was cultural ritual. It was continuity with the past. It was preparation for the future. And many of these stories were about night itself, about darkness, about the things that inhabited darkness, because night, for our ancestors, wasn't empty space. It was inhabited. And in the absence of scientific explanations, it was inhabited by things imagination created. Shadows that moved could be wind in leaves, or could be something more. Sounds in the distance could be known animals, or could be unknown creatures. And that occasional feeling of being watched, that shiver down the spine without apparent cause, this demanded explanation. So cultures around the world created mythologies of night. And fascinatingly, despite thousands of kilometers of separation, despite no contact between cultures, similar themes appear repeatedly. Nocturnal creatures that are dangerous but can be avoided if you know the rules. Spirits that inhabit specific places, rivers, forests, mountains. Gods or forces that govern the transition between day and night, between light and darkness, between life and death. Why? Because these are universal human fears and observations. Fear of darkness is universal. The observation that certain places seem scarier at night is universal. The need to explain inexplicable natural phenomena is universal. And stories about these creatures and forces served practical purposes disguised as supernatural narrative. A story about malevolent spirit inhabiting a specific part of the river? Maybe it's because that part has dangerous currents, or crocodiles, or unexpected depth. Telling children, "Don't go there, it's dangerous," might not be enough. But telling a vivid story about the child who ignored the warning and was taken by the river spirit? That fixes in memory. That creates healthy fear that keeps the child safe. A story about nocturnal creatures that chase those who wander alone at night. This reinforces the practical rule that wandering alone at night is dangerous. Real predators, risk of getting lost, accidents in the dark. The story makes the rule memorable and respectable. Could many of our superstitions actually be ancestral safety knowledge disguised as mythology? And there are stories about night and day themselves. Creation myths explaining why the sun sets and the moon rises, why stars exist, why darkness is necessary as much as light. Many cultures personify day and night as deities or forces in eternal cycle or struggle. The sun as God who travels across the sky and then dives into the underworld, fighting forces of darkness to be reborn each morning. The moon as goddess with her phases representing cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Stars as ascended ancestors watching over the living. These weren't just beautiful stories, they were cognitive frameworks that helped understand and accept the world. Because accepting that the sun would always return, that night would always end, that cycles were reliable, this reduced existential anxiety. This created a sense of order in a world that could seem chaotic and threatening, and stories created group cohesion. When everyone in the group knows the same stories, shares the same cultural references, believes the same explanations about the world, this creates shared identity. This creates us versus them, our group with our stories versus other groups with different stories. This isn't necessarily positive. It can lead to tribal conflict, but it also creates group loyalty, internal cooperation, sense of belonging. And for small groups trying to survive in hostile environments, this cohesion was survival advantage. And the most skilled storytellers, they probably gained special status. In a society without formal entertainment, without books, without media, someone who could tell a captivating story was a valuable resource. someone who memorized traditional stories, who performed them well, who maybe even created new stories. That person had power. In many cultures, this eventually formalized. Griots in West Africa, Celtic bards, Aidos in ancient Greece, professional storytellers who memorized genealogies, epic stories, cultural knowledge. They were living libraries, walking archives of group knowledge. And all of this began, probably, with someone sitting around a campfire tens of thousands of years ago, beginning to tell about something that happened and realizing that everyone around was listening, was engaged, was absorbing not just information, but vicarious experience. There was also another type of story told at night. Dreams. We've touched on dreams before, but it's worth expanding, because dreams were experiences that demanded explanation. You close your eyes, become unconscious, and then have vivid experiences, sometimes more vivid than reality. You fly, you talk to dead people, you visit impossible places, and then you wake up and everything disappears. For a mind without knowledge of neuroscience, without concept of subconscious, dreams seem to be literally another reality. A reality you accessed during sleep. And this reality seemed to have meaning, seemed to contain messages. So telling dreams was common activity. And interpreting dreams, trying to extract meaning or omen from them, was taken seriously. In many cultures, dreams were seen as more true than waking reality in certain ways, as access to hidden knowledge or future. And occasionally, someone would have a particularly vivid or strange dream that would become part of group mythology. Let me tell you about the dream old Tama had before he died. He saw a great firebird flying from the sun. And this dream would become story, repeated, elaborated, eventually part of cultural tradition. There was also the special case of lucid dreams. Dreams where you become conscious that you're dreaming and can exercise some control. Some cultures developed techniques to induce lucid dreams, and those skilled in this were often shamans or spiritual leaders. They claimed to be able to use dreams to travel to the spiritual world, speak with ancestors, obtain knowledge or healing. And from a neurological standpoint, lucid dreams are a real phenomenon, a state where parts of the brain associated with waking consciousness are active even during REM sleep. But without this knowledge, the experience seemed to be literally travel to another plane of existence. Curious, isn't it? How brain biology created experiences that were then culturally interpreted in ways that shaped entire religious and spiritual beliefs. And all these stories were but about nocturnal creatures, about gods and spirits, about dreams and omens, were told mainly at night. Because that's when the audience was gathered, when the atmosphere was right, when external darkness made the story world more real than the physical world around. And children, they absorbed all of this, not as formal lessons, but through repeated exposure. A child who grew up hearing stories night after night, year after year, eventually knew all the traditional stories of the group, knew the moral lessons, the practical warnings, the cosmological explanations, all packaged in memorable narratives. And when that child grew up and became an adult, eventually elderly, they became a storyteller, passing the same narratives to the next generation, with perhaps small variations or elaborations. And thus, cultural knowledge was preserved and transmitted through generations, all through the medium of oral narrative. We've lost much of this in the modern world. We have writing, so we don't need to memorize. We have individual entertainment, books, screens, headphones, so we rarely share narrative experiences as a group. We have scientific explanations for natural phenomena, so we don't need myths. But maybe we lost something in the process. That sense of wonder, that connection through shared narrative, that experience of sitting in semi-darkness, surrounded by known people, and immersing in a story told in living voice, with pause and emphasis and emotion. Not that we don't tell stories anymore, we do, through films, series, books, even memes. But it's different, it's mediated through technology, it's often consumed alone, not communally, and it rarely has that element of direct transmission from person to person, living voice to attentive ear. And there's something about stories told at night, specifically, that's different from stories in other contexts. Maybe it's the vulnerability of darkness, maybe it's the day's tiredness that makes mental defenses lower, making you more emotionally receptive. Maybe it's simply accumulated tradition of tens of thousands of years that created deep association between night and narrative. Whatever the reason, it works. Stories told at night have special power, and our ancestors knew this and used it night after night, generation after generation, creating and preserving culture through the simple act of telling stories in darkness. And these stories shaped how they saw the night, not just as dark physical space, but as place inhabited by meaning, by history, by invisible but real forces in collective imagination. And this imagination shaped behavior, shaped choices, shaped how they interacted with the nocturnal world around them. But night wasn't just a stage for stories about other times or places. It was also a stage for real actions, for concrete social structures. And that's where we need to look next, how groups organize specifically to deal with the demands and dangers of night. Society that doesn't sleep. We've explored how individuals dealt with night, their senses, their shelters, their stories. But humans are profoundly social animals. We rarely face challenges alone. We organize, cooperate, create systems, and night was no exception. In fact, night may have been one of the greatest catalysts of human social organization, because night created vulnerability that no individual could solve alone. But a group, a well-organized group, could transform vulnerability into relative safety. Let's start with the most obvious structure: sentries. Imagine yourself 40,000 years ago. Your group of maybe 20 to 40 people is camped in a sheltered valley. Fire burns in the center. Most people are sleeping, wrapped in hides, clustered for warmth. Children sleep deeply, exhausted from the day's play. Elders snore softly, but not everyone sleeps. Always, there's someone awake. Sometimes it's one person sitting near the fire, feeding it occasionally, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. Sometimes it's two people talking in low voices, keeping themselves awake through conversation. Sometimes someone walking slowly around the camp perimeter, stopping to listen, to observe, to sense. These are the sentries, and their role was absolutely critical. Because while a group sleeps, it's vulnerable. Predators know this, human enemies know this. And while fire offers some protection, it's not absolute guarantee. An exceptionally hungry lion, an exceptionally aggressive rival group. These could overcome fear of fire if the reward seemed worth it. The sentry was the first line of defense. It was the difference between being caught completely by surprise and having crucial seconds of warning. Seconds that could be used to wake the group, to grab weapons, to form coordinated defense. And being a sentry wasn't just sitting passively. It required skill. It required sustained attention for hours in semi-darkness. It required ability to distinguish between normal night sounds, wind, small animals, falling branches, and abnormal sounds that could signal danger. It also required resisting the overwhelming urge to sleep. Because the human body wants to sleep at night. It's deep biological programming. Fighting against this, staying alert when everything in you is saying sleep, sleep. This takes considerable willpower, so groups likely developed strategies to make this easier. Short shifts, maybe 2 or 3 hours, instead of one person trying to stay awake all night. Sentries in pairs, where conversation helped both stay alert. Tasks to do during watch, fire maintenance, tool preparation, that kept hands and mind busy. And there was probably hierarchy or system for who did sentry duty when. Young adults at peak strength and alertness probably did most shifts, but experienced elders could take shifts too. They had accumulated knowledge of decades, knew how to recognize subtle signs that youngsters might miss. And here's something interesting. Taking sentry shifts created trust. You're sleeping, completely vulnerable, trusting that the awake person will protect you. That's not small responsibility. And fulfilling this responsibility night after night, consistently, creates deep bonds of mutual trust. It's possible that the concept of reliability, of personal honor, of responsibility to the group, has roots in nighttime sentry systems. Because if you can't trust someone will stay awake during their shift, if you can't trust they'll be alert, then the whole group is in danger, and occasionally the sentry would have to make decisions. A sound in the darkness. Wake the group? Or wait to see if it's really a threat? Waking the group unnecessarily means interrupted sleep, tired people the next day, but not waking the group when you should could be fatal. So sentries had to develop judgment. They had to calibrate their sensitivity, not so sensitive that they woke the group for every little sound, not so insensitive that they missed real threats. And this judgment came with experience, with mistakes, with collective learning. But sentries were only one part of nighttime social organization. There was also the question of how sleeping space was organized. It wasn't random. It wasn't everyone choosing an arbitrary spot. There were patterns, and these patterns reveal much about social priorities. Generally, the most vulnerable, small children, frail elders, sick people, slept closest to the fire. It was the warmest place, most protected, most central. In case of attack, they were the hardest to reach. Young, strong adults slept more on the periphery. They were the second line of defense. If something got past the sentry, they were the first to be awakened, first to grab weapons, first to confront the threat. And families tended to sleep together, parents, children, sometimes extended relatives. This wasn't just emotional comfort. It was practical. Parents protected children. Body heat was shared, and if there was an emergency, the family could coordinate quickly because they were close. In larger groups, there could be even more complex organization. Different families or subgroups occupying different areas of camp space, not necessarily separated by walls. Remember, most of these camps were outdoors or in open caves, but separated by space, by tacit agreements about territory. And this spatial organization became even more important in permanent or semi-permanent shelters. Caves occupied for generations developed designated areas. This section for sleeping, that section for work, that area near the entrance for the main fire and sentries. There were also nighttime rituals that served important social functions. Curious, right? Leave your thoughts in the comments. One of the most universal was probably the gathering around the fire before sleep. Not just sitting casually, but an intentional moment where the group came together, ate together if there was food, maybe shared events of the day, told stories, sang. This served multiple purposes. It reinforced group cohesion. Everyone together sharing space and experience. It allowed planning. Tomorrow we'll hunt in that direction. We need 4 people. It allowed conflict resolution. Disagreements could be discussed and resolved before they festered. And it created psychological transition from active state of day to resting state of night. And there were probably specific rituals for certain moments or events. Full moon could have special significance. Maybe a time for ceremonies, for celebrations, for making important decisions under the brightest light of night. Lunar or solar eclipses, when they happened, must have been profoundly significant events. The sun or moon being devoured, then returning, this demanded explanation, demanded ritual, maybe demanded group action to help the sun or moon return. And going through these rare events together as a group created powerful shared memories. Births and deaths had their own nighttime practices too. Many traditional cultures have rituals where the body of the dead is watched during the night before burial. People take turns sitting with the body, telling stories about the person, processing grief collectively. This may seem morbid to modern mentality, but it served important functions. It gave the group time to process loss. It allowed proper farewell. And it reaffirmed continuity of the group. Someone left, but the group continues, and we honor those who left by keeping their memories alive through story. And births? Babies often are born at night. There's evidence that labor often begins in nighttime hours, and birth would be a community event with experienced women assisting, with the group waiting anxiously, with celebration when the baby arrived healthy. Night was also when specialized knowledge was often transmitted. Shamans or healers could teach apprentices at night, away from day's distractions, techniques for making fire, for napping stone, for preparing poisons or medicines. Delicate or dangerous knowledge was passed in quiet moments, with full attention. And as human groups became more complex, as they began to have specialization, as this man is particularly good at making spear points, that woman is expert in identifying medicinal plants, night became time for mentorship, for learning, for skill refinement. There was also the question of how groups interacted with other groups at night, because humans didn't live isolated. There were other groups in surrounding territory, sometimes allies, sometimes neutral, sometimes hostile. Seeing distant fire or smoke at night meant there are other humans there. Depending on the relationship, this could be comforting or concerning. Close allies? Good to know where they are. Strangers? Better increase vigilance, and occasionally, groups met deliberately. Maybe at a neutral location, a specific clearing or known rock formation. These meetings could be for trade, exchanging tools, foods, information about hunting or weather. Could be for social arrangements, marriages between groups, creating alliances. Could be for conflict resolution or territory negotiation. And interestingly, some of these meetings happened at night. Why? Maybe because that's when both groups were at their camps, not dispersed hunting or gathering. Maybe because night created more neutral, less threatening atmosphere than daytime approach. Or maybe because firelight created intimate environment that facilitated negotiation and communication. And there was the question of collective security on large scale. In regions where large predators were constant threat, lions, saber-toothed tigers, bears, multiple groups could coordinate, camp closely, share sentries, essentially create security network where if one group was attacked, others could hear and come help. This required cooperation beyond immediate group. It required recognizing that collective security benefited everyone, and bonds formed through this cooperation probably extended to other aspects of life. More frequent trade, stronger alliances, intergroup marriages. Night then didn't just shape organization within groups, it shaped relations between groups. It created needs that forced cooperation, that built increasingly complex social structures. And as human populations grew, as groups became tribes and tribes eventually became larger societies, these nighttime systems formalized. Sentries became professional guards. Nighttime rituals became elaborate religious ceremonies. Sleeping spaces became planned architecture. But the roots were there, in those first small groups sitting around campfires, developing systems to deal with night's vulnerability. Systems based on trust, cooperation, intentional organization. Systems that ultimately helped make us the most collaborative species on the planet. Because we're not the strongest, not the fastest, don't have the sharpest claws or longest teeth, but we cooperate on scales no other species can. And part of this capacity for cooperation was forged in ancestral nights, when survival depended on trusting each other, working together, creating systems that worked even when individuals were vulnerable. And while these social systems made night safer, more manageable, there was still an emotion that never completely disappeared, an ancient and deep response to darkness that no amount of fire or social organization could totally eliminate. Fears that shaped us. We've spent 9 chapters exploring how our ancestors adapted to night, how they navigated it, how they created tools and systems and culture around it. But there's one aspect we've mentioned several times but haven't fully explored yet, an aspect that is perhaps uncomfortable to admit, but absolutely fundamental to understanding the human experience of night. Fear. Our ancestors were afraid of darkness. And before you think, of course, they were primitive, they didn't understand the world. No. Their fear was completely rational, completely justified. Because night was, objectively, more dangerous. But here's what's fascinating. This fear wasn't weakness, it was strength. It was a survival tool. And understanding how fear worked, how it shaped behavior and decisions, helps us understand not just our ancestors, but ourselves today. Because that chill you feel when you're alone in the dark, that need to check if the door is locked before sleeping, that impulse to look over your shoulder when walking at night. That's not irrational, it's ancestral. It's deep programming that kept your ancestors alive long enough to pass their genes forward. Let's start with the most obvious fear: predators. For most of human history, we weren't at the top of the food chain. We were prey as much as predator, and many of the animals that hunted us were nocturnal or crepuscular, most active exactly in the hours when our vision was weakest. Lions on the African savanna, leopards hunting from trees, hyenas working in coordinated groups, tigers in Asian forests, cave bears in glacial Europe. The list continues, and all of them had enormous advantages over humans. At night, superior night vision, sharper hearing, sense of smell that could detect humans from far away, physical strength that made direct confrontation almost always fatal for the human, and the element of surprise. They could approach silently in darkness, while humans struggled to see beyond a few meters. So fear of nocturnal predators wasn't paranoia. It was realistic risk assessment. And here's the crucial part. Those of our ancestors who felt this fear appropriately, who took it seriously, were the ones who survived. Those who were careless, who ignored danger signs, who wandered alone in darkness without caution, these tended not to live long enough to have many children, so over generations healthy fear of night was selected for. Not paralyzing fear, that would also be maladaptive, but fear that promoted caution, vigilance, intelligent defensive behavior. And this fear didn't make our ancestors passive, it made them creative. Because when you're afraid but can't simply run away or hide all the time, you innovate, you find solutions. Fire, which we've already explored, was largely a response to this fear, not just for light and warmth, but specifically as defense against predators. The ability to create a barrier of light and smell that most animals instinctively avoided, that transformed the security equation. Improved shelters were another response. Not just any shelter, but shelters designed with defense in mind. Entrances that could be blocked or defended. Locations on cliffs or elevated areas where predators had difficulty reaching. Multiple exits in case one route got blocked. Weapons too. Spears weren't just for hunting, they were for defense. A long spear could keep a predator at distance, could be used in groups to create a barrier of sharp points. Cutting tools could be used as last resort if confrontation was inevitable. And the social systems we explored in the last chapter, sentries, group coordination, alarm signals, All of these were in large part responses to fear of nocturnal predators. So fear didn't paralyze, it motivated, it drove innovation. And eventually, through accumulation of small advantages, fire, better weapons, better shelters, better coordination, humans changed the equation. We stopped being easy prey and became, gradually, the dominant species. But predators weren't the only nighttime fear. There was also fear of other humans, because unfortunately, other human groups could be as dangerous as any animal. Competition for resources, hunting territories, water sources, gathering areas could lead to conflict. And nighttime attacks had the strategic advantage of surprise, so fear of nighttime attack from rival humans shaped behavior too. Careful choice of camp location, defensible areas with good visibility, difficult to approach without making noise, extinguishing fires or keeping them small when in potentially hostile territory, to not reveal location, even more rigorous sentry systems. And interestingly, this fear may have promoted development of diplomacy and alliance, because if you're afraid of being attacked, one strategy is to become strong enough or have enough allies that attacking you isn't worth the risk. Forming alliances with neighboring groups, creating networks of trade and intergroup marriage, establishing mutually recognized territories, all of this reduced the risk of nighttime conflict. So even fear of other humans, as dark as it is, drove more complex social organization. There were also more psychological fears: fear of the unknown, fear of getting lost, fear of darkness itself. Because darkness isn't just absence of light. To the human mind, it's absence of information. You don't know what's there, and when you don't know, your mind tends to assume the worst. It's safety programming. Better to assume that shadow is dangerous and be wrong than assume it's safe and be fatally wrong, and this bias had interesting consequences. It made humans naturally cautious in ambiguous situations. When in doubt, assume danger. When in doubt, be conservative. This meant more false positives, often interpreting harmless things as threats. But in survival terms, false positives were much less costly than false negatives. Getting scared by a shadow that's just a tree, you lose a few seconds. Not getting scared by a shadow that's actually a predator, you die. So this cautious bias, this instinct of better safe than sorry, was deeply selected for, and we still carry it today. There's something almost comforting about that, isn't there? When you feel that irrational nervousness in the dark, when you check if the door is locked for the third time, you're not being foolish. You're being exactly what tens of thousands of years of evolution programmed you to be: cautious, vigilant, careful, and fear also shaped learning. Children who saw adults reacting cautiously to nighttime situations learned to do the same. Not necessarily through explicit instruction, though stories certainly helped, but through imitation, through observing adult behavior and copying it. A child who saw parents checking the perimeter before sleeping, who saw tension in adults when there were strange sounds at night, who was comforted when expressing fear of the dark. That child learned that fear wasn't shame. It was appropriate. It was normal. It was what kept you safe. And interestingly, fear may also have promoted cognitive development. Because to deal effectively with fear, you need certain mental skills. You need ability to assess risk. Is this danger greater than that one? You need ability to plan. If this happens, what do I do? You need ability to imagine scenarios. What if? All of these are complex cognitive skills. And practicing these skills constantly, because nighttime fear was constant, may have contributed to development of increasingly sophisticated human brains. There was also the community aspect of fear. Shared fear creates bonds. When you've been through a frightening experience with other people, say, a night where a predator circled the camp, where everyone stayed awake and tense, where they worked together to keep the fire strong and stay alert, this creates shared memory, common experience, sense of "we went through this together." These moments of shared fear and shared overcoming may have been as important for group cohesion as happy moments of celebration or abundance. And over time, as humans became more dominant, as tools and organization improved, the balance shifted. Night became less frightening. Not completely safe, never completely safe, but manageable. Predictable enough that you could sleep without constant terror. And this allowed the next level of development, because when you're not in constant survival mode, when you have some psychological security, you can do more, can innovate more, can create art, music, more elaborate knowledge systems, can think beyond the next immediate threat. So in a sense, mastering fear of night, or at least learning to manage it effectively, was a prerequisite for much of what we consider civilization. But even today, even in modern urban environments, with street lighting and locks and security systems, that ancestral fear persists. Not at the same intensity, obviously, but at the edges of consciousness. Why do children fear the dark? Why do we prefer walking in well-lit areas at night? Why do horror movies use darkness so effectively? Because they're tapping into deep, ancient fears rooted in our evolutionary history. And maybe, just maybe, keeping a bit of this fear isn't a bad idea. Not paralyzing fear, but healthy respect for darkness, appropriate caution, attention to environment, because the world may be safer today, but it's not perfectly safe. And those instincts that kept our ancestors alive still have value. Night taught us to be afraid, and fear taught us to be intelligent, cautious, innovative, cooperative. It taught us to respect forces greater than ourselves, to not be arrogant, to always maintain a certain level of vigilance. These were hard lessons, learned through countless generations, through countless losses. But they were lessons that shaped who we are as a species. And as night became more manageable, as tools and knowledge accumulated, humans reached a significant transition. Not just surviving night or managing it, but beginning to transform it in deeper ways. And that transformation began with something simple but revolutionary. When night began to change. So we've spent 10 chapters exploring the ancestral night, how it shaped our bodies, our senses, our fears, our culture. And for much of this story, night was a fundamental force that humans had to accept. Work with it, adapt to it, respect it. But at some point, something began to change. Not suddenly, not with a single revolutionary invention, but gradually through small innovations that accumulated, the relationship between humans and night began to transform. We've already talked about fire, the first and most important light technology. But fire had limitations. You needed constant fuel, it produced smoke, it was dangerous in enclosed spaces, and it was essentially fixed. You could carry torches, yes, but torches burned fast and required constant attention. So humans began to experiment, to innovate, to find ways to make artificial light more controllable, more portable, more efficient. One of the first innovations beyond simple campfire was the fat lamp. We've mentioned this briefly, but it's worth exploring more deeply because it was surprisingly sophisticated technology for its simplicity. The basic idea: you take a container, a shell, a piece of stone with natural depression, eventually specially made ceramic bowls. You fill it with melted animal fat. You place a wick, initially maybe just dry moss or twisted plant fibers, later linen or cotton. You light the wick and voila, portable, controllable light. Seems simple, but think about the implications. Suddenly you had light you could move. That burned relatively steadily for hours without constant attention. That produced much less smoke than a torch. That could be used in deep caves or enclosed shelters without suffocating everyone with smoke. And the quality of light was different. Softer than burning torch, more constant than campfire. It was light you could work beside, make delicate tools, sew hides, prepare foods that required precision. Archaeological evidence shows stone lamps dating back tens of thousands of years. And not just one or two. Hundreds have been found, especially in caves known for rock art, because to create those detailed paintings in deep caves, you needed stable light, and fat lamps provided exactly that. Imagine for a moment. You're an artist 20,000 years ago. You descend into the depths of a cave, carrying several stone lamps filled with reindeer fat. You position them strategically, creating illumination that highlights the natural curves of the rock wall. And then you begin to paint bison, horses, hands, symbols. The lamplight would flicker gently, making your creation seem almost alive, almost moving. It was primitive kinetic effect, animation through dancing light. And when other people visited later, bringing their own lamps, they would see the paintings the same way, flickering, alive, magical in the semi-darkness. But fat lamps also had limitations. Fat was a valuable resource. Food, basically. Using it for light meant not eating it. And the light produced, while better than torch, was still relatively dim and yellowish. So as societies became more complex, as trade developed, other options began to appear. And one of the most significant was oil. Plant oil, and olive oil especially, but also oils from various seeds, could be used similarly to animal fat but had advantages. It burned more cleanly, produced less smell, and in regions where it was cultivated was more abundant than animal fat. Oil lamps became especially important in ancient Mediterranean civilizations, Greece, Rome, Egypt. Elaborate ceramic lamps were mass-produced, some simple and functional, others artistically decorated. Some wealthy homes would have dozens of these lamps, creating illumination that was, by standards of the time, almost luxurious. And for the first time, artificial light began to be commoditized. You could buy oil in the market, could buy lamps. Light production became less about individual skill in maintaining fire and more about access to resources and trade. This had interesting social implications. Wealth could be demonstrated through lighting. A well-lit house signaled prosperity, and nighttime activities became more viable for those with resources to buy sufficient oil. But there was still a challenge. Oil, like fat, was liquid. Container was necessary. And while lamps were portable, they could spill, especially if you were moving. Enter candles. Candles are fascinating technology because they solved the portability problem elegantly. Instead of liquid in container, you have solid fuel, beeswax or tallow, molded around a wick. The heat of the flame melts wax locally, which then feeds the flame through the wick. But the wax itself is solid, so there's no spilling, and candles could be made in standardized shapes, could be stored easily, could be transported without special care. And they burned very predictably. You could estimate how long a candle would last based on its size. In fact, candles eventually became a way to measure time. Burn until the second mark on the candle was an instruction that worked reasonably well. And graduated candle clocks were used in various cultures as simple but effective timers. Beeswax was preferable, burned cleaner, smelled better, produced brighter light. But it was expensive. So for centuries, wax candles were luxury, used mainly in religious contexts or by the very wealthy. Tallow candles, solidified animal fat, were more accessible but had disadvantages. Strong smell, sometimes unpleasant, darker smoke, weaker light, but still they were better than total darkness. The story is coming to an end, but what comes next is the most reflective part. Stay with me. And as these technologies spread, as they became more accessible, night began to change character. Not radically. Most people still slept when it got dark and woke with dawn. But at the margins, there was change. Artisans could work a bit later, finishing a piece under lamplight. Scholars and scribes could read and write at night. taverns and social gathering places could remain open after sunset. And for the first time, there began to be significant social division in how night was experienced. The wealthy, with access to abundant oil or beeswax candles, could illuminate their homes extensively, could choose to be active at night, could, in a sense, extend the day. The poor, without these resources, still lived more traditionally, at the mercy of natural cycles of light, sleeping when it got dark because there was no practical alternative. This division would become even more pronounced with later developments, but the seeds were there. Artificial light was beginning to become not just a survival tool, but a status symbol, productivity tool, form of control over one's own time. And in urban centers beginning to emerge, cities of Mesopotamia, ancient Rome, eventually medieval European cities, there were even first attempts at public lighting. Not street lighting in the modern sense, but sometimes lamps placed at temples or public buildings, creating islands of light in an ocean of darkness. Occasionally, wealthy homes placed lanterns outside, both for security and as demonstration of prosperity. And in some cities, during festivals or special celebrations, there would be coordinated lighting effort, many candles, many lamps creating collective glow that transformed the urban night into something almost magical. But even with all these innovations, night retained much of its ancestral character, because artificial light, as useful as it was still local. It created bubbles of light in vast darkness. And outside these bubbles, night was as dark, as mysterious, as potentially dangerous as it ever was. Traveling at night was still risky. Forests and open fields at night were still territory of wild animals, and even in cities, dark alleys and unlit streets were places where crime thrived. So while technology offered new possibilities, the fundamental respect for night, the ancestral caution, remained appropriate. Night was beginning to change, but slowly, very slowly. And there was something else. These new light technologies, as wonderful as they were, required resources, required production, trade, economy. You couldn't just go out and find light like your ancestors could find wood for a campfire. This created dependencies. Dependence on oil suppliers, on candle makers, on trade systems that brought these products to you. And if these systems failed, war, natural disaster, economic collapse, suddenly you were back in darkness. So there was a certain fragility to this new relationship with night. You gained control, but lost self-sufficiency. It was a trade-off that would become increasingly pronounced over time. And there was still the cost factor. Artificial light cost money. Each hour of candlelight or lamplight was a resource consumed, so even those with access still used light sparingly. You didn't illuminate the entire house. You illuminated the area where you were working, where you were reading, where you were socializing. The rest remained dark. It was conscious, deliberate use of light. Very different from the modern attitude of flip a switch and illuminate everything. And there was also different appreciation of light. When light is rare and costly, you notice it. You appreciate it. The softness of a lit candle, the way shadows dance, the intimate circle of light creating cozy space in dark room. There's a quality to candlelight that electric light doesn't replicate. It's not just the color spectrum, though that's part of it. It's the movement, the imperfection, the way it makes faces softer, more mysterious, the way it creates atmosphere that cold fluorescent light never could. Have we lost something in gaining perfect and constant illumination? It wouldn't be reasonable argument to go back to candles. The safety and convenience of electricity are obvious, but maybe it's worth, occasionally, turning off the electric lights and lighting some candles, to remember, to reconnect with that older, more human experience of light in darkness. And as these technologies developed, as night began its slow transformation from uncontrollable natural force to partially manageable space, humans were also changing their conception of night. No longer just time of fear and sleep, but also time of possibility. Time for specialized work. Time for reading and learning. Time for socialization in ways that weren't practical before. Night was, millennium after millennium, decade after decade, being domesticated. Not completely, not totally. But gradually, inexorably, darkness was receding. And then, much more recently, in terms of human history, it's like a blink, came the most dramatic change of all. A change so profound, so transformative, that it fundamentally altered the human experience of night in ways our ancestors couldn't even have imagined. But before we get there, before we explore this final revolution of light, it's worth pausing, reflecting, looking back through all these eras, all these adaptations, all these innovations, and asking, what did night really teach us? What did it make us? And what perhaps are we losing now that it's been, for the most part, eliminated? The legacy of ancestral darkness. And here we're, at the end of this journey through the ancestral night. We've traveled from those first deep and complete nights through millions of years of adaptation, innovation, transformation, and we've arrived at a turning point that would change everything: electric light. When Thomas Edison perfected the practical incandescent lamp in 1879, he probably didn't fully realize he was initiating the greatest revolution in the human experience of night since the control of fire. Because electric light wasn't just better light, it was fundamentally different light. Light that didn't require constant fuel. Light that could be turned on and off instantly with a switch. Light that could be produced in quantities that would make any oil lamp or candle seem pathetic in comparison. And within decades, a blink on the timescale we've explored in this journey, the urban night was transformed. Illuminated streets, brilliantly lit homes, work continuing 24 hours, nighttime entertainment becoming more vibrant than daytime entertainment. Darkness, which had governed half of each day for the entire history of life on Earth, was pushed back. Not completely eliminated, but drastically reduced. And this brought enormous benefits: safety on streets, increased productivity, expanded creative possibilities. The list goes on, but it also brought losses. Subtle, perhaps, not immediately obvious, but real. We lost the stars. Not literally, they're still there, but light pollution from modern cities erases most of them. Billions of people today live their entire lives without ever seeing the Milky Way, without seeing that starry sky that was map, calendar, source of wonder and inspiration for all of human history until now. There's something deeply impoverishing about that. That connection with the cosmos, that sense of being in a vast and mysterious universe. It's hard to feel when the night sky is pale orange with urban glow, and you can see maybe a dozen stars. We lost darkness. And that sounds strange to say, because darkness seems to be absence, not presence. But darkness isn't just nothing, it's something. It's a state that has value of its own. True darkness, the kind our ancestors experienced regularly, recalibrates the senses, forces you to depend on hearing, touch, intuition, creates sense of vulnerability that, while uncomfortable, is also humanizing, reminds you that you're not totally in control, that there are forces greater than you, and darkness is necessary for quality sleep. We've already explored circadian rhythms, how melatonin is suppressed by light, and now we live in environments where light is present almost constantly. Bright screens until minutes before trying to sleep, street light filtering through windows, digital clocks glowing, LEDs blinking, and we wonder why so many people have sleep problems. We've also lost a certain rhythm of life, Our ancestors lived synchronized with natural cycles. Not perfectly. Fire and eventually lamps gave some flexibility. But fundamentally, day was for activity, night for rest. Today, we can be active at any hour, and that's freedom, yes, but it's also confusion. Our bodies still expect the old rhythm, but our modern lives ignore it. Night shift work, jet lag across time zones, irregular sleep routines. All of this goes against millions of years of programming. And there are costs. Metabolic dysregulation, weakened immune system, increased depression and anxiety. All of this is correlated with circadian dysregulation, with not respecting the natural rhythm of light and darkness. We've also lost certain forms of community. Remember the gatherings around the campfire? Where everyone came together, shared stories, created culture collectively? We still have forms of community, of course, but it's different. It's mediated through screens. It's asynchronous. You watch a show at one time, I watch at another. It's individualized, headphones, private rooms, each person with their own device. There's less of that direct sharing, of that collective, simultaneous experience of narrative, of that real-time creation of culture through face-to-face interaction in semi-darkness, and we've lost a certain quality of attention. Our ancestors, without constant distractions, could focus deeply. A story told at night had the total attention of the audience. There were no notifications, no impulse to check a screen. It was just the voice, the story, the campfire. Today, even when we try to focus, there's constant fragmentation. And there's something about darkness and quietude that facilitated that kind of deep and sustained attention that's increasingly rare in the modern world. What a journey, right? If you enjoyed traveling with us, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. And if you have any reflections, share them in the comments. But before sounding too nostalgic, too much, the old days were better, let's be honest. We don't want to go back to the ancestral night in its entirety. We don't want the constant fear of predators. Don't want the real vulnerability of being in the dark without resources. Don't want the high infant mortality, short life expectancy, diseases that were common when medical resources were limited. And electric light, with all its side effects, brought wonders. Nighttime surgeries saving lives. Creative work happening in the quiet hours of night. Connections between people in different time zones. The list is long, so it's not a question of going back, it's a question of integrating, of recognizing what was lost, and finding ways to recover some of the benefits, even while living in the modern world. And there are ways. Small ones, perhaps, but significant. You can create darkness deliberately. Turn off lights earlier at night. Use blackout curtains. Remove or cover bright LEDs. Avoid screens in the hours before sleep. It's not viable for everyone nor in all situations, but for many, small changes can reconnect you with more natural rhythms. You can seek real darkness occasionally. Camp far from cities. Visit dark sky parks where stars are still visible. Allow yourself to experience that sense of wonder that comes from seeing the Milky Way stretched across the night sky. You can create intentional nighttime rituals. It doesn't have to be around a campfire, but maybe a moment of family gathering without screens, maybe telling stories to children, not from a book, but from memory in the dark. Maybe lighting candles occasionally and sitting in their soft light just for a few minutes to remember how night used to be. You can respect your circadian rhythm, at least partially. Sleep at more consistent times, seek strong, natural light during the day. Darken the environment at night. It won't be perfect. Modern life has demands. But even partial attention to these rhythms can make a significant difference. And maybe, most importantly, you can cultivate respect for night, not paralyzing fear. but recognition that night is different, that it has its own character, its own qualities, its own value. Because night isn't just less illuminated day. It's something of its own. It's when the world gets quieter, when certain forms of creativity flourish, when deep reflection becomes easier. It's when you can disconnect from the frenetic pace of day and reconnect with yourself. And all those millions of years of adaptation to night, they didn't disappear. They're still in you, in your genes, in your nervous system, in your deep biological rhythms. You're still, at a fundamental level, a creature shaped by the ancestral night. And ignoring this, constantly fighting against it, has costs. But honoring it, working with it, finding ways to live that respect, at least some of the ancient rhythms, this can bring benefits: better sleep, more stable mood, sense of connection with something greater than yourself. So as you settle in to sleep today, maybe in a dark room, maybe with just a soft night light, think about this. You're part of a lineage extending millions of years. Your distant forebears, your human ancestors, all of them faced the night. All of them found ways to survive, to adapt, to even thrive in darkness. And they passed to you not just genes, but legacy. Legacy of resilience, of creativity, of capacity to find light, even in the deepest darkness. Every night you sleep, you're doing something billions of humans did before you, surrendering to natural rhythm, trusting that the world will continue while you rest, knowing that dawn will come. And there's comfort in that, there's continuity. There's a sense of being part of something much larger and older than your individual life. Night shaped humanity. It taught us to cooperate, to innovate, to tell stories, to have healthy caution, to appreciate light, to value community, to respect forces greater than ourselves. And though the modern night is different, safer, more illuminated, more controlled, those ancestral lessons still have value. Those ancient adaptations still have purpose. You don't need to live as your ancestors lived, but you can honor what they learned, can carry forward in your own modern life a bit of that ancient wisdom about rhythm, about community, about respect for darkness, about the importance of sometimes just stopping, being quiet, and letting night be what it is. Because night still has gifts to offer. Quietude, reflection, deep rest, dreams, renewal. And that rare and precious sense of peace that comes when you stop fighting, stop trying to control everything, and just surrender. Surrender to the ancestral rhythm. Surrender to darkness that isn't enemy, but necessary part of the cycle. Surrender to the sleep your body is asking for, and when dawn comes, and it always comes, you'll awaken renewed, ready for another day, carrying in you that ancient wisdom of night, that resilience forged in darkness over countless generations. You are heir to the night, and that's a wonderful thing to be. Sleep well.